early Buddhism. In her book, Early Buddhism, A New Approach, Sue Hamilton writes, quote, "I have come to think that it is by starting with an attempt to understand what the experience of enlightenment involved and what it meant that one can best understand what Gautama Buddha subsequently taught. This is partly because it was not until after he had had the experience that he taught anything at all, and partly because he himself said that everything he taught was intended to help others to have the same experience, and only that," end of quote. This is an extremely important insight by Hamilton. The main question then would be, what kind of experience is the experience of enlightenment, that is the experience of nirvana? And how the Buddha attained this experience, and how could anybody else also perhaps attain the experience of nirvana? I will argue that the experience of enlightenment or nirvana is essentially intertwined with the experience of breathing. In relation to my claim, it is important to acknowledge that according to the Buddhist Pali Canon, the Buddha attained the experience of enlightenment, that is the awakened state of nirvana as the highest ethical and spiritual way of being, through the meditative practice of mindfulness of breathing, Anapanasati. In my interpretation, it was the mindful awakening to the experience of breathing that taught the Buddha a philosophy, Dharma, that he then himself taught later to his disciples. It is also why he taught Anapanasati to his disciples, that they could attain the same experience that he had attained. Let us focus on the method of Anapanasati, this mindfulness of breathing method. The word Anapanasati literally means either mindfulness of inhalation and exhalation, remembrance of inhalation and exhalation, or full awareness of inhalation and exhalation. How should we understand the relation between sati as mindfulness, full awareness or remembrance, and anapana as inhalation and exhalation, that is breathing? In such texts as the Great Discourse on the Foundations of Mindfulness and the Sutra of Full Awareness of Breathing, Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha teaches his disciples, bhikkhus, the method of Anapanasati as mindfulness of breathing, as remembrance of breathing. That is the method that guided himself to the experience of nirvana. Let us listen to the Buddha's words. In the Greater Discourse on the Foundations of Breathing, he teaches Anapanasati as follows, and then quote Buddha, "The bhikkhu, disciple, who has either gone to the forest, to the root of a tree, or to an empty house, sits down cross-legged and folds his legs, makes his body erect, and with the resolve he establishes mindfulness around all around him. He breathes in mindfully, he exhales mindfully. Taking in a long breath, he knows I'm taking in a long breath. Or exhaling a long breath, he knows I am exhaling a long breath. Or taking in a short breath, he knows I'm taking in a short breath. Or exhaling a short breath, he knows I am exhaling a short breath. He trains himself thinking, I will breathe in, experiencing all of my body. He trains himself thinking, I will exhale, experiencing all of my body. He trains himself thinking, I will breathe in, calming the processes of my mind. He trains himself thinking, I will exhale, calming the processes of my mind. Just as a skillful turner or turner's apprentice, when he turns a long turn, knows I'm turning a long turn, or when he turns a short turn, knows I'm turning a short turn. Just so a bhikkhu, breathing in a long breath, knows I'm taking in a long breath, or exhaling a long breath, he knows I'm exhaling a long breath. or taking in a short breath, he knows I'm taking in a short breath, or exhaling a short breath, he knows I'm exhaling a short breath. He trains himself thinking, I will breathe in experience in all my body. He trains himself thinking, I will exhale, experiencing all of my body. How could we interpret and then to my text, how could we interpret the basic ideas of Buddha's Anapanasati? Could it be essential? What could it be essentially about? Currently, one of the most well-known conceptions of mindfulness of breathing is from John Kabat-Zinn. How does he understand the relation between sati and anapana? In his interpretation, this relation between sati as mindfulness and anapana as breathing is a relation in which the mindfulness or the awareness is the most important, not the breath, nor any other object of attention. Of this, Kabat-Zinn says, eventually, through ongoing mindfulness practice, we may discover that it is not the breath that is actually the most important element in this meditative equation between breath and awareness. It is awareness itself that is the most important and where the real transformative potential lies. The breath is simply an extremely useful object of attention in cultivating our ability to dwell in awareness and act out of embodied awareness. End of quote. This means that the practice of mindfulness meditation, this means that in the practice of mindfulness meditation, nothing will challenge, in Kabat-Zinn's words, the overriding importance of awareness itself. Here he calls the breath an extremely useful object of attention. Elsewhere, he has called the breath the primary object of meditative attention. According to Kabat-Zinn, cultivation of one's meditative capacities always begins by developing a mindful relation with the breath, that is, by paying attention to one's own breathing. As one's mindfulness practice always begins with paying attention to the breath, for this reason it is that he calls the breath the primary object of attention. Why is the breath the first object of mindful awareness? In Kabat-Zinn's view, the mindfulness is about cultivation of moment-to-moment awareness. Being mindful of one's own breath is the easiest and most effective way to begin cultivating mindfulness as a formal meditative practice. Why is it the breath the most easiest and most effective, and thus the primary object of awareness? One of the answers that Kabat-Zinn gives for this is that, quote, as long as we live, breathing is always with us. We can't leave home without it. It is always here to be attended, no matter what we are doing or feeling or experiencing, no matter where we are. Turning into it brings us right into the here and now. Breathing immediately anchors our awareness in the body, in the fundamental rhythmic following life processes, end of quote. All of this means that the breath as the primary object of awareness or attention is a dependable ally and useful servant of awareness of its developmental processes. The objects of meditative attention can very well also be something other than the breath. For example, something we are seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, feeling, or knowing in any given moment. Important point here is that in mindfulness practice, we have to always pay attention to something. As phenomenologists would say, attention is always attention of something. Kabat-Zinn's key point, as was already mentioned, is that cultivation of mindfulness is not primarily about the object of attention, but about the awareness itself. What is interesting is that even if the awareness is the most important in mindfulness meditation and not the breath, as the primary object of attention, Kabat-Zinn still praises highly the importance of breathing. He, for example, says, quote, "The breath plays an extremely important role in meditation. Breathing is an incredibly powerful ally and teacher in the work of meditation. Also, people who have no training in meditation think nothing of it and find it uninteresting. Breathing is the universal foundation for meditation." End of quote. These words on breathing as a teacher and universal foundation for meditation connect in an important manner what Kabat-Zinn says about the Buddha in the following quotation, quote, "Attending to the feeling of the breath in the body is not only a beginner's practice. It may be simple, but the Buddha himself thought that the breath has within it everything you would ever need for cultivating a full range of your humanity, especially your capacity for wisdom and for compassion. The reason is that paying attention to the breath is not primarily about the breath. It is awareness that is primary." End of quote. In my opinion, Kabat-Zinn does not take his own words about the extreme importance of breathing in meditation seriously enough. In his interpretation of Anapanasati, in which the primacy of awareness stays always the most important dimension of meditation, it is impossible that breathing could become a true teacher and truly the universal foundation in the work of meditation. Because that would mean that the awareness could become a student of the breath that could challenge the primary role of attention. Also, if breathing is truly understood as the universal foundation for meditation, this could mean that the breathing founds awareness, which again could mean that perhaps the awareness is not primary, at least not always. These problems concerning the relation between meditation, breathing, awareness, teacher, and the foundation at least partially arise out of Kabat-Zinn's lack of phenomenological concept of breathing. In his books, he explicitly conceptualizes breathing either as a natural scientific object or as a primary object of meditative attention. In his natural scientific concept, breathing is a question of physiology, and it is taken care of by the brainstem, and it is basically gas exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. In meditative practice, the breath is understood as an object of attention or of awareness. In Kabat-Zinn's view, it is awareness that perceives the sensation of the breath, and thus the breath is a perceived object. For him, the breath cannot become a subject, that is a breathing subject. In this presentation, I challenge Kabat-Zinn's interpretation of the Buddha's Anapanasati with the help of Merleau-Ponty's ontological notion of reversibility. Merleau-Ponty understands reversibility as the fundamental phenomenon and ultimate truth of being, that is our entire being in the world. His famous example of the fundamental phenomenon of reversibility is of the painter who feels that it is not anymore he who looks at the forest, but the trees that are looking at him. This example can be found from Eye and Mind, and it goes like this, quote, "Inevitably, the roles between the painter and the visible switch. That is why so many painters have said that things look at them. As André Marchand says after Klee, in a forest, I have felt many times over that it was not I who looked at the forest. Some days I felt that the trees were looking at me, were speaking to me. I was there listening. I think that the painter must be penetrated by the universe and not want to penetrate it. I expect to be inwardly submerged, buried. Perhaps I paint to break out. What is called inspiration should be taken literally. there is really and truly inspiration and expiration of being, respiration within being, action and passion, so slightly discernible that one no longer knows who or what sees, who or what is seen, who or what paints, and who or what is painted, end of quote. In the fundamental phenomenon of reversibility, one no longer clearly knows who or what sees or who or what is seen. This means that the roles between the perceiver and the perceived, between the subject and the object, are constantly shifting. From the perspective of Merleau-Ponty and reversibility, Kabat-Zinn's interpretation of the meditative practice of mindfulness of breathing seems too straightforward. Within this atmosphere of reversibility, mindfulness and breathing, or awareness and any object of attention, are intertwined in a way that the person practicing Anapanasati or mindfulness meditation in general no longer knows clearly who or what is aware and who or what is the breath, who or what is the perceiver and who or what is the perceived. The same can be said of the relation between the meditating subject and the object of attention. In Phenomenology of Perception, we can actually find Merleau-Ponty's brief description that we could call by the name of respiratory reversibility, in which it is impossible anymore to know who or what breathes and who or what is breathed. This description is about the process of falling asleep, in which one calls forth with a certain kind of breathing the sleep. In this description, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, "The sleep arrives when a certain voluntary attitude suddenly receives from the outside the very confirmation that it was expecting. I was breathing slowly and deeply to call forth sleep, and suddenly, one might say, my mouth communicates with some immense exterior lung that calls forth and foresees it back. A certain respiratory rhythm desired by me just a moment ago becomes my very being, and sleep intended until then as a signification suddenly turns into a situation," end of quote. In my view, this brief description of the process of falling asleep is full of meaning that can be intertwined with the meditative practice of Anapanasati as mindfulness of breathing. How would that be? In his classic book, Yoga, Ernst Wood writes, quote, "The breathing desirable during meditation is somewhat similar to that during sleep, in which the movement is slower and deeper and quieter than during ordinary wakeful activity," end of quote. So if the desirable breathing as breathing slowly and deeply possibly in some ways brings together the sleeper and the meditator, could there be other uniting factors between them? If we think of a person who wants to fall asleep and a person who wants to become a Buddha, that is an awakened one, I suggest that the desirable breathing that Wood referred to is something to think about. As was mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, according to the Pali Canon, the Buddha attained the experience of nirvana by practicing Anapanasati. This means that he became the Buddha, the awakened one, in collaboration with the breath. Could this mean that in a similar fashion, as according to Merleau-Ponty, one calls forth sleep by breathing slowly and deeply, one could also call forth awakening, that is, the Buddhahood, by breathing slowly and deeply. Merleau-Ponty also says about falling asleep, quote, "I lie down in my bed on my left side with my knees drawn up. I close my eyes, breathe slowly, and distance myself from my projects," end of quote. Immediately after these words, he continues by saying, quote, "But this is where the power of my will or consciousness ends. Just as the faithful in Dionysian mysteries invoke the god by imitating the scenes of his life, I too call forth the visitation of sleep by imitating the breathing and the posture of the sleeper," end of quote. Let us compare these words of Merleau-Ponty to how the Buddha began his instructions about how to practice Anapanasati. The Buddha said, a bhikkhu, the disciple, who has either gone to the forest, to the root of a tree, or to an empty house, sits down cross-legged and folds his legs, makes his body erect, and with resolves, he establishes mindfulness all around him. He breathes in mindfully, he exhales mindfully. Taking in a long breath, he knows I'm taking in a long breath. Or exhaling a long breath, he knows I'm exhaling a long breath. Both the one who wants to sleep and the one who wants to awaken to become a Buddha withdraw themselves from the ordinary daily activities. The first withdraws to lie down in bed. The second one withdraws to the root of a tree or to an empty house. In both cases, the bodily posture plays an important role for the project to be successful. The first lies in a bed on his left side with his knees drawn up. The second one sits down cross-legged and legs folded and making the body erect. Sleep is connected with lying in a horizontal posture and awakenedness with vertical sitting posture. Both Merleau-Ponty and the Buddha also bring up the right type of state of mind in order that the efforts would bear fruit. In both cases, the mental activity is reduced into a simpler form. The one who wants to sleep needs to be able to place out of one's mind all the daily projects. The one who wants to awaken also needs to do this in order to establish an atmosphere of mindful attitude around himself. For both, these are withdrawal steps that are connected with the imitation that is taking place in both cases. The first imitates the breathing and the posture of the sleeper. The second one imitates the breathing and the posture of the Buddha. They are both projects of fake it till you make it, and only by faking it first can the making it become possible, but not guaranteed. Could Merleau-Ponty's description of what happens when one is able to fall asleep also enlighten something to us, perhaps, about the possibility, about the possible success of the bhikkhu, the disciple of Buddha, on his mindfully respiratory path to nirvana? So the description said, the Merleau-Ponty's description, I was breathing slowly and deeply to call forth sleep, and suddenly one might say my mouth communicates with some immense exterior lung that calls forth and forces it back. A certain respiratory rhythm desired by me just a moment ago becomes my very being, and sleep intended until then as a signification suddenly turns into a situation. Here we can see that at the sudden moment when one falls asleep, one's mouth communicates with some immense exterior lung that takes over one's breath. This communicative respiratory reversibility between the sleeper and the immense exterior lung creates a certain respiratory rhythm that now becomes the sleeper's very being. If the Buddha attained the awakened experience of nirvana through the path of Anapanasati in the way that he described in his introductory guiding words to his bhikkhus, his disciples, then wouldn't that mean that there is something profoundly respiratory in nirvana? That respiratory path of Anapanasati that I already quoted included the following respiratory training. He trains himself thinking, I will breathe in experiencing all of my body. He trains himself thinking, I will exhale experiencing all of my body. He trains himself thinking, I will breathe in calming the processes of my mind. He trains himself thinking, I will exhale calming the processes of my mind. The word nirvana is often translated in the Buddhist context as liberation, that is, as liberation from all bondage, or or as extinguishing, that is as extinguishing of dukkha, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness. But it is important here and now to listen to the etymological meaning of this word. Etymologically, nirvana is a respiratory word, as it means blowing out. Prefix nir means out, and the word va means to blow. Here is what Alan Watts says of nirvana in one of his talks from 1960s, quote, strictly speaking.
Sorry, Petri,
yes.
We're running out of time, so we have 15 minutes left, but that includes questions as well.
I have maybe this much left.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so strictly speaking, the word nirvana, so this is the quote from Alan Watts. Strictly speaking, the nirvana in Sanskrit simply means to blow out. That is to blow out in the sense of we, to breathe a sigh of relief, like ah. And this word was chosen because the breath is one of the fundamental symbols of life. End of quote. Perhaps we could intertwine the Buddha's and Merleau-Ponty's descriptions and say that the awakening respiratory experience of nirvana as blowing out is an immense sigh of relief at all levels of human existence. In this fundamental phenomenon of respiratory reversibility at the level of nirvanic experience, no one knows anymore who breathes a sigh of relief between the meditator and the immense exterior lung. Perhaps, following the words of Kabat-Zinn that I already quoted, we can begin to make much more sense to us if they are brought into this newly formed context of respiratory nirvana, where Merleau-Ponty's fundamental phenomenon of reversibility and the path of Anapanasati is intertwined. And these are the last words from Kabat-Zinn, which would make more sense in this newly found context of respiratory reversibility. The breath plays an extremely important role in meditation. Breathing is an incredibly powerful ally and teacher in the work of meditation. Also, people who have no training in meditation think nothing of it and find it uninteresting. Breathing is the universal foundation for meditation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very interesting talk.
Sorry. So we have a wireless microphone now.
Yeah.
Feedback. So we'll open for questioning. I think the sound is very bad.
I wonder.
Just a second. Petri, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, but not anymore.
Maybe we'll just return to the old format.
Do I need to close something myself to help?
I think there's just interference from the main system in the room here. But Jim, if you could come forward, and then we can just continue like this.
Petri, hi, it's Jim Morley.
Hello, Jim.
How are
nice
you?
to hear you.
I'll just be real quick. I agree with you that breathing is foundational and it's absolutely important in meditation. But there are many meditation traditions that that would say that it doesn't matter which object you focus on. The one-pointed focus could be an image, it could be a visual object. That, you know, there's many traditions that would say that it's not necessary, it doesn't have to be breathing. Breathing happens to be the handy one because it's there, but does it have to be breathing all the time? That's my question. It's not a radical difference with you, I'm just not sure you need to focus on breath all the time with meditation.
Well, I would say that it doesn't, of course, it doesn't have to be the attention of object, or it doesn't have to focus on breathing. But I think that when we focus on something else, then there also is an interesting thing. What happens is that already itself affects our breathing. So then also that reversibility between that other object that we are relating with or having like a object of attention in the meditation. So what happens then to breath, because we are kind of attending toward that object? I find also that very interesting question. And then the other thing is that from my respiratory philosophy point of view, I think there is something in the extremely important why Buddha focuses so deeply on Anapanasati and why he himself attained nirvana through it. And as I explained, that it's actually a respiratory word, because when we focus on something like an object of attention in meditation, those are normally object relations where the meditator is, like the word itself says, the object of attention. They are object relations, even if there is a meditative quality to that. But the breath, what is interesting in the breath, which I didn't go in this paper, is that the breath itself connects us immediately with the atmosphere of air. So it's not in the first place an object relation, which is not very often, even in the meditative literature, that is not very often being focused on or pointed out. But it's true that the objects of attention in meditation can be other things also, as I quickly mentioned in the paper. But also then I would find very interesting to think of that reversibility between the breath, what happens to the breath while we are attending to some other meditative object. Thank you very much, James, for your question, and I'm very happy to hear from you.
Okay, so we have a few questions also. You can look, Petri, at the chat, and okay. I'll just read them out. The first one is from Ingeborg. Thanks for your interesting paper, Petri. It struck me that you embodied mindfulness in the way you approached your lecture, in the way you used your breath and the use of repetition. Could you elaborate on that a bit, maybe?
I will read again the question. Well, I think that this is often my style, this kind of repetition of and emphasizing certain kind of points, but also perhaps at this time it had to do with that I didn't have super much time to prepare for this paper, because I am organizing at the moment actually a breath conference, respiratory philosophy conference, which has taken so much time from me. It starts in Helsinki, one of the first respiratory philosophy conferences ever to be held in world. It's called Airy Encounters, Respiratory Philosophy and Sound Arts. And but the how I use my breath, I would say that that might be connected with quite long way of practicing my breath. Who knows?
Okay. I'd like to ask a question as well.
Yes.
I found it interesting that you spoke of awareness as being something almost beyond subject and object, as though there is no object of the awareness. So awareness is, it just, I mean, how do you envision that? You describe the breath as altering when the awareness is just being awareness, but you didn't elaborate at all on how the breath might be altered. I'm thinking perhaps because we have a certain element of control over the breath, which ordinarily is an automatic experience, but we can also consciously influence it. What about those instances when we're conscious, but we're not consciously influencing the breath? Does the automatic character of the breath alter as well in these meditative practices?
Can you say the last thing again?
Does the automatic character of the breath alter when our awareness in meditative practices is not focused on it specifically?
Well, I would say that everything that we consciously focus on, or what's the quality of our consciousness wherever we are focusing it, it always is affecting the breath in a certain sense. Like there is always this reversibility between, for example, in my PhD, which I wrote about the phenomenological ontology of breathing, my idea there was to open a new kind of concept of breathing, in a sense that the breath itself is a foundation of our consciousness. Like if we talk about consciousness as consciousness of something, so there is a respiratory consciousness, which is the primary level of the consciousness, and other levels of consciousness, for example, perceptual consciousness, and then practical consciousness and theoretical consciousness. These are built over it, and there needs to be done a lot of different kind of research about it. But all of these levels, they are intertwining between each other, and how in certain kind of cases, and this happens, of course, this is very difficult to say because it varies. But then you also mentioned to this that I have this concept of awareness, which is not connected with an object. And that's where I would say that there is this respiratory consciousness, which I was very briefly developing in my PhD, which now will be published as a Routledge book by the end of this year, hopefully, where the idea is that the consciousness itself, as a respiratory consciousness in the first place, is not an object consciousness, but it's an atmosphere consciousness. And then that makes it possible that this kind of consciousness related to object consciousness, or this kind of relating, becomes possible. But there was quite many things in your questions. I didn't most probably answer all of what you were asking.
It was a decent response. So obviously, I think it would probably take a lot longer to have a discussion about that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We're going to move on to Susi Ferrarello now. Good luck also, Petri, with your new workshop that you were talking about, the conference that you'll be doing on breathwork. And now I'll invite Susi Ferrarello.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Susi Ferrarello probably just woke up. She's very many hours behind us. I think what time is it over there now?
Well, now it's okay. Now it's 8.
Okay.
I'm really sorry I cannot be there with you. I feel so far away. It must be a wonderful experience to be there.
Yeah, Cyprus is very nice.
Yeah.
Too bad, but at least we can do this remotely as well.
Right.
Okay, well, Susi, I'll let you start. Just jump right in with your paper. If you would just say the title and
right.
so that everybody can.
I'm very sorry you must be all tired at this point, and I will lay over you a little bit of Stoicism and phenomenology. But as I will share with you my screen, so while I'm reading my paper, you can read the paper with me. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Husserl and Stoicism. So I will compare the theory of Lecton and the theory of Neuema. I move away from the theory of breathing, but not that much actually. I keep going, yeah, I keep moving somehow in the territory of how sense, how life informs us in a mindful way. Anyway, we'll see. So let us look at some different scenarios. One, you forget that the kettle is still hot, almost as a reflector. When you touch it, you say, ouch. Two, while taking care of your garden, you get close to your favorite roses, smelling their petals, a smile comes to your face. Three, your favorite song starts playing in the background while you are doing your grocery shopping. You feel somehow happy, even if you don't know exactly why. The brain takes between 100 to 140 milliseconds to see what we perceive and react to it. In that short period of time, our body prepares to respond to the event in an appropriate way. The bodily response is the closest structure we have to a thought pattern or proto-logic that governs, or more precisely, is part of our actions. Some of the most important thought patterns and related bodily schema through which we live are formed within repeated events that take place in this very short period of time. The first scenario shows the bodily logic behind involuntary pain and its expression. The second scenario points to the logic that our body uses to bring pleasure to itself. The third scenario shows the logic of affections and the power they have to cheer us up, whether we are aware of it or not. These three scenarios shed light on positive mechanisms that we use to learn how to function properly in the environment. The problem arises when we have been exposed for a long time to a toxic environment and we have developed sort of self-harming logics, by which I mean a combination of thought pattern and body scheme, such as in the case of abandonment anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder. Being able to fix those logics requires mindful efforts towards self-awareness. In this paper, I will use Stoicism and Husserl's phenomenology to flesh out the constitutive moments in which our body language and its embodied logic react to certain stimuli in order to cope with the environment. Thus, I will consider mindfulness in terms of the fully aware mind one can put into one's own actions, something similar to the Greek phronesis. In particular, Husserl's theory of Neuema and the Stoics' theory of Lecton are focused on disembodied logic that trains human beings to focus on the here and now of their lived experiences. In both theories, we see how the problem of sense, meant as the concreteness of reality that we encounter in our experience, influences the way we form self-determining reflections that shape our character and the way in which we react to life. Hence, in this paper, I will first show the continuity between Stoicism and phenomenology before moving forwards toward a more detailed confrontation between the theory of the Lecton in Stoicism and the theory of the Neuema in Husserl's phenomenology. Finally, I will show how these theories apply to both the phenomenological and Stoic ethics and what they can tell us about choosing to live a happy, flourishing life. So, continuity between Stoicism and phenomenology. Although distant in time and space, Stoicism and phenomenology have important points of continuity with each other. Husserl openly praises the acuity of the Stoic as a Leben philosophy that, similar to his own phenomenology, proposes a fully rounded study of rationality that interconnects logic, ethics, and aesthetic in one fluid system. According to Madison, the ancient Stoics laid out an ethical system that, as something approaching an ethics of pure practical reason, is prototypically phenomenological. An example of this can be found in the intellectual proximity of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and Husserl's Caeso articles, as both are designed to ensure progress toward the ideal of wisdom, exercise of reason that will be for the soul analogous to the athlete's training or to the application of a medical cure. Similarly, Cicero presents philosophy as a medicine for the soul, animi medicium philosophia. Husserl too describes philosophical life as a vocational life in which the ongoing clarification of our practical reason brings guidance and meanings to one's life. Both Stoics and Husserlian ethics encourage the sense of responsibility that each individual requires to lead a good life. As Epictetus stated in the opening line of the Enchiridion, the crucial thing to know is the difference between what is up to us and what is not up to us, and learn how, accordingly, to exercise our faculty of free choices, prohairesis in Greek. To do so, the journaling of Stoics, as much as phenomenological descriptions, are spiritual exercises devoted to coming back to the things themselves and raising awareness toward our agency in the life world. To do so, both interpreted the philosophical life as one lived in a lucid and joyful awareness of what Epictetus would call the wondrous fair. That is the word which Eugen Finn, Husserl's later assistant, would call an immeasurable astonishment over the mysteriousness of the being of the world itself. Phenomenological and Stoic logic both focus on the study of this encounter with the concreteness of reality, and they can teach us something of great importance for a mindful approach to life in our life world. Thinking straight and secundum naturam. The Stoic tripartition of philosophy into ethics, logic, and physics is in fact strongly connected to this assumption. Our physical body, as well as being our way of experiencing the world, is strictly shaped by the thoughts that animate our actions in the world. Hence, the adagio secundum naturam points to the healthy direction one has to stick to in life to act rationally. To live a life that is in accordance with reason, the human being has to humor the best part of oneself, as Seneca put it, that is to live life according to nature. Similarly, as Husserl writes in his Cartesian Meditations, everyone lives in the same nature that they have fashioned into a cultural world in their individual and communalized living and doing. A life of meaning, Husserl reminds us, is a life whose roots are in nature, our nature. For this reason, it is important not to replace nature with cultural constructions or mathematical idealizations that are abstracted from our personal life. In fact, rationality does not have its roots in an objectivity that is unrelated to our lived experience. Rather, it is a living evidence that we embody in our daily life, whose roots bring us back to the deepest sense of who we are. To live a life of virtue, a life that conforms to the right order of things, that is discernible by philosophical insight, or what Stoics called syneidesis, is to live a properly human life, an authentic life, a life of self-fulfillment according to freedom and happiness, eleuteria, kaiodaimonia, An authentic life, an expression that Husserl also uses in his Kaiso article, is a life lived according to vocation, a life in which the individual is capable of interpreting their own nature and the way it expresses itself in the world, and to be able to become who they are according to the deepest values they are called to achieve. The fulfillment of one's life is achieved in the sense that they devote themselves to what is right for their nature. Happiness, both for Stoics and Husserl, but not only for them, is a complex combination of material and evanescent being. Now, the evanescence of sense. Understanding how far words can go and what their limits are is the key to a happy life. Words and the way in which we construct them in our language are a vehicle of sense. Sense itself is a title of a philosophical problem. In fact, both for Husserl phenomenology and Stoicism, sense, seen here in Germany, is an embodied cluster of data whose concreteness is as evanescent as a concept, but also as sensuously present in our being as the food in our stomach. According to Annas, to Stoicism, perceiving is thinking, not the reception of raw data. And language is the color through which we express that thought. Unfortunately, these colors are often blurred and imprecise. From this, what Epictetus states above follows. Human beings are not disturbed by the things which happen, but by the language we use to color and give shape to that experience. The way in which affections shape our lives is a matter of fact that make our lives as they are. The emotional charge that we use to express a certain sense in language can impact our well-being in one direction or another. The problem of sense helps us to see the subtle difference between our ability to engage with and be affected by the objects of our experience, and our ability to express those senses and assign words to them. As Husserl learned from Brentano, every mental phenomenon includes something as an object within itself, although they do not all do so in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. For every intentional state, that is, for every time I engage with life in the way in which appears to me, there is something which the state is directed to. This means that sense is an unknown encompassed in this engagement with life, which Husserl and Brentano would call aboutness, directedness. In other words, if I represent an apple, the aboutness of the intentional state is related to the apple, and its sense comes to me in my attempt to engage with this object that I call apple. What I'm claiming, in line with the Stoic position, is that our mental states are physical as well as mental. The richness of my reality and its positive influence on my body is determined by the attitude with which I engage with it and try to explain its sense to me. The sense is, in fact, itself a function for which we live or we should live. Being able to live according to nature means to be able to function, Leistung in Husserl's vocabulary, in relation to sense, in a way that is as approximate as possible to what sense demands. Stoic theory of Lecton and Husserl's theory of the Neuema, the problem of sense. We are going more and more inside of what sense means. As mentioned above, Husserl praises the Stoic approach to logic in several places, where he consistently acknowledges the importance of their concept of Lecton. Similarly, Deleuze in his Logic of Sense and Sartre in his Being and Nothingness show how Husserl's account of Neuema presents strong similarities with the Stoic theory of Lecton. In fact, both Neuema and Lecton indicate a sense that although incorporeal and ontologically evanescent, it is embodied in our expression and make our expression alive and meaningful. The Stoic theory. Lecton, literally what can be said, sayable, belongs to what the Stoics call dialectic, which itself is a part of the logical structure of the systema, that is the structure of reality. Lecta are thus bound into the framework of Stoic ontology. As Seneca and other important representatives of Stoic philosophy state, the lecton is something, yet for the Stoic to be something is simply to be proper subject of thought and discourse. A lecton can be said, but can also not be said, in the sense that the lecton does not coincide with language. It might never be said at all, and yet it remains an unperturbed lecton. As Juliana remarks, lecta are conveyed in language, in our minds, they are conveyed in a language of thought. Perception in humans involves lecta, since they imply that we receive an appearance containing propositional content, and also involve our assent to the lecton, expressing the content of that appearance. Perception, in other words, is the way in which our responsible interaction with the lecton starts as we experience the reception of and commit to information about what is perceived. In perception, only one kind of lecton is involved, namely statements or axiomata. With the theory of the lecton, we are confronted with the curious paradox according to which thinking is engaged perception. Thinking equates to the responsibility we take when we commit to be present to what we are experiencing, while expressing this thought in words is not thinking, but is a value activity, for which we assign value symbols, a number, word, a gesture, to what we perceive. The values through which we express our thoughts can be existentials, existent and non-existent, or symbolic, numbers, words, or strictly ethical, positive or negative. This two-step process, committing the engagement and axiological activity, is key to the attitude that we assume when interpreting the sense of the reality with which we interact. The mindful process goes from the reception of sense data to the absorption into propositional form of the sense data received, to a fully fledged thought which constitutes the rational impression in accordance to which there subsists a lecton. If we manage to be as present as possible to this process, we can build a system of thinking that positively impacts our being, or meaningfully more than positively. Creating meanings and expressing them is an embodied process. The lecton of which reality is composed are not pre-given answers, but they are carriers of a sense that affects the subject and eventually enables its dianoia, illuminated mind, to utter what he or she has in mind. Our language finds its shape and expression around the lecton, and so the rational structure of our world mirrors this language. Lecta are not language dependent, but our answer to their input structures the way in which we form our worldview. A lecton subsists and can be expressed in many ways, but it does not need expression in order to be. To use the example of a person who went through a traumatic experience, it takes effort to express fully through speech the lecton of that experience. And until that lecton is fully expressed, the reality would still lack sense or would feel somewhat indistinct. And yet this, embedded with the notion of a lecton as thing which can be said, is precisely the feature which makes the lecton feel right when someone utters the correct expression. Hence, Lects are there for us, but at the same time, it would seem they cannot be there for our functioning if we are not capable of creating thought patterns or bodily schema, dance, for example, for an artistic expression, capable of expressing their sense to the fullest. Now, Husserl's theory of Neuema. Both Husserl and the Stoics' approaches to logic start from the rational description of the concreteness of reality. Eule, matter, as its meaning is determined in the encounter with our experience. Zeno asks, what then is the matter for the philosopher? Namely, how do we understand the elements of our own reason? What are its components and how do they fit to one another? In Neuema is the answer that Stoics, but not only then, and phenomenologists would give to these questions. In Neuema are the embodied thoughts that refer to the way in which the content of what we experience in the world dwells in us as mental representations. Husserl's word Neuema, which relates etymologically to the Stoic term in Noemata, refers to nous, meaning the mind or thoughts that dwell in our soul. What Husserl's phenomenology calls the intentional X points here to the Greek expression paronapon, present absence, to indicate not only how the matter of our being in the world becomes an evanescent mental pattern, which is sensed when we engage with it, but also shows how this pattern shapes the way in which we reflectively come back to relate to the world itself. In fact, present absence gives an immediate sense of the problem encompassed in the term intentionality, a property that entails a present that is absent at the same time. When I reflect upon my own intentional X, I set aside the object that is perceived in order to attend to the object as held in my consciousness, an object that is no longer the transcendent object with the same ontological structure, but is the content of intention, of that tension that somehow concretizes the object under a different form, precisely expressed in Greek with the locution presence in absence. The apple I want to eat is in my mind as a new object whose sensuous property, smell, taste, texture, mirror the concreteness of the apple I mean to eat. The primary structure of an intentional essence is a correlation of matter and quality. They are unthinkable separately because the quality is the way in which matter presents itself, while matter is that which the quality presents. To use the example above, this is a good apple to eat. The matter is the concreteness of the apple, and its quality is its goodness for me and the name that this object has for me. As Husserl writes, act quality is undoubtedly an abstract aspect of the act, and the matter is to a certain extent its concretum. Or in the case of the red patch, the matter would be red and its quality red in brackets, where the quotes would stand for representation of. The quality can be combined with every objective reference and only determines whether what is already presented in the defined fashion is intentionally present as wished, asked, posited in judgment. The matter must be that element in an act which first gives its reference to an object, but also the precise way in which it is meant. Matter is that side of the intentional essence that it grasps the object, but also as what it grasps it. Yet the intentional essence does not exhaust the act phenomenologically. We could not speak about intentional essences if the fullness or vividness of the sensuous contents did not help to build the act. By fullness, we mean the concreteness of reality as it represents itself to our act of apprehension, and therefore causes the intentional act. The intentional act can be directed to an object if there is a fullness, a concrete object that stimulates that directedness. Similar to the lecton, the Neuema So the content matter of the intentional act is not the object toward which the act is directed, but rather is the directedness and the aboutness that connects my thought to the intended object and enables the hyletic data, the concreteness of matter, to connect with the object. The Neuema is that through which the object is grasped in all its fullness, while the noesis, as its static noetic moment, is the meaning bestowing act, or the concretely complete intentive mental process correlated to it. The noesis include what Husserl formerly called the quality of the act, but it holds here a larger function because it is responsible for bestowing sense, for constituting the meaning of what it grasps. The concreteness of reality engages with us with adequate apodictic evidence. But to reach it with my meanings, I need to fulfill the emptiness of symbols that my logic uses and make adequate the meaning of my sense to the fullness. Therefore, the truth, the meaning, the sense is represented to me by the ongoing process of finding a full adequacy to the concreteness of the noematic sense. This adequacy is always considered as self-referential consistency in which the given object is experienced as the meant one. It corresponds to an Evidenzgefühl, feeling of evidence, and the Leistung, functioning, the unity of a positing of reason with that which essentially motivates it, which is unintelligible in terms of a feeling or a feeling of evidence, involving some sort of index of truth. This process of becoming adequate does not, of course, rule out, but rather integrates the act of intersubjective validation. Intuitions must, in fact, be clarified and verified by others. Hence, Husserl's phenomenology would agree with Sextus' statement. They, Schilicet, the Stoics, say that electon is what subsists in accordance with or on the basis of a rational representation, katalogiken fantasian iphistamenon. And a rational representation is one in which what is represented can be exhibited in language. By doing so, the lecta, as much as the noemata, would clearly appear to be validated in the intersubjective context by the spoken shared language of the community. That brings the sense into existence for us. Now, how do we connect everything with mindfulness again? Has emerged so far, both Stoicism and Husserl's logic rest on an embodied engagement with sense, for which the linguistic expression becomes a secondary exercise built upon our ability to encounter sense and to connect with it in an embodied way. For both, the very first step of any thought process is being present to the perception, the primal functioning with which our living body engages with our world. The actual process of what we call thought is an ongoing self-reflecting process in which we try to make our perception more and more adequate to the concreteness that has been perceived, but not yet put into words. While sense, as it is called in the lecton or in the Neuema, to use Husserl and Stoic terms, remains the same whether or not we are able to think or express it. The way in which we react to it and build our thoughts, as well as bodily scheme around it, has the power to determine our character and well-being in society. The exercitia spiritualia of the Stoic are thus ones that are carried on by the means of language and in discourse, and keeping of personal notebook, or in Greek noemata, that are directed towards the development of self-control and building of the character. Virtue, in this sense, is the key to happiness. Here, happiness, eudaimonia, and not what happens to me, must be understood as that form of flourishing that occurs due to that Gefühlsevidenz, felt evidence, that is, to users' terms, the feeling of adequacy that we experience when we engage with life in a way that resonates with our experience of it. That's what I meant. Finally, I can utter my lecton, this encounter with selves. Husserl also thought that this preeminent form of intentionality is what awakens the sense of our limits and pushes the subject, the awake subject, Wache-Ich, to constitute its phenomenon through the noetic and noematic act. Husserl is here describing the moment immediately before the intentional determination that transforms the dilating matter of the biological body, Koper, into a living body, life. My life discovered itself as the primal answer to that evidence call. First and foremost, the body discovered itself as evidence of being and being able to do. My life is the title for such evidence, Husserl writes. I decide to live or use myself and my original field of potentialities in order to be and to answer the call of this preeminent intentionality. What is necessary to a complete responsible answer is my being awake, active, and free. Happiness is a spiritual
Susi,
exercise.
Can I just interrupt you a little bit? We have
Sure.
we have 15 minutes left for questions.
Okay.
I don't know how everybody feels about staying a little bit longer, but it looks like you still have another 5 pages or so. Or
No, it's this. Can you see it? It's this paragraph.
Okay, so yeah, if you could close up swiftly.
Do you want me to stop here? I'm okay. I mean, I think at the
It's up to you. If you feel like if you might want to say a final few words to sort of bring it all together.
All right, so I will read this final paragraph. Both for Stoics and Husserl's phenomenology, sense is a never-ending problem whose concrete presence we can approximate through language and an embodied feeling of evidence. Giving up on this work of approximation might lead to a chaotic and meaningless life world, where we do not feel at ease or in which we feel constantly anxious. Happiness for the Stoics was not a rosy full cup of pleasure. In fact, as Cicero put it, the more a person drains this cup, wherever offered, the greater will be his thirst and more wretched will be his life. The general consensus of the ancients was that, unlike pleasure, happiness, or well-being, can never be something one aims at directly. Genuine well-being only comes from leading a life that is dedicated to the pursuit of sense, which involves a disciplined moderation of one's passions and desire in such a way as to achieve mastery over oneself. The self-empowered life, the life lived in accordance with one's moral purpose, is the only kind of life that merits being called happy. A good character, Seneca said, is the only guarantee of everlasting, carefree happiness. That's all. The other pages were bibliography.
Okay, yeah, I see that now.
Sure. All right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
We have a few questions here in the audience.
Okay.
Have we figured out how to work the, no? Okay, so maybe it's better. Are you going to come?
Oh, I thought she was coming too.
No.
No. Sorry.
Okay.
Susie, Hayden Key here.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. This is a fairly simple question of interpretation, I think. You want to bring the Husserl's Neuema and the Stoic lecton kind of into contact with one another. And I'm just wondering if that depends on a certain interpretation of the Neuema.
Certainly.
And specifically, my guess is that, if you take a kind of West Coast reading on the Neuema, then Neuema and object are much closer to one another. Whereas on an East Coast reading, Neuema separates a bit from object. My sense from the talk is that I think if you want to bring it close to the lecton, you have to take the East Coast reading, or pardon me, the West Coast reading, and pull apart object and Neuema a little bit more than the West Coast does. So am I right on that reading? And, you know, are you kind of comfortable in accepting that, or do you want to say anything more on that topic?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe it's useful to write a footnote on that, because of course, if you read the Neuema in terms of Föllstall, for example, the lecton and Neuema cannot be comparable in any way, because you know, it's more the meaning aspect, the linguistic aspect of the Neuema that prevails. So the Neuema is what can be literally said and expressed. But if you take Gerwig, for example, the interpretation of Neuema as these calling for sense, these unknown X that calls for sense and brings together the meaning, well, then, yeah, the comparison is very, very easy. Now, for me, the fact that Deleuze, Sartre, Husserl himself compared himself to Stoics and the theory of Neuema is a theoretical tool I will use to say to Föllstall, for example, hey, see, maybe we are right in interpreting the noetic-noematic relationship in a more carnal and bodily sense, which would explain why, for example, Merleau-Ponty went in the direction of the reversibility theory, the schema. You know, it explains how we arrive to a certain phenomenology. While Husserl's of logical investigation, since there weren't many other books yet published in the Husserliana or manuscripts already, edited, led to a certain cold intellectualism that I don't always share, actually. So yes, what you said is completely implied in my talk. And it becomes for me an additional tool to say, maybe it's safer to go in this direction rather than the other one. Yeah.
Thanks, Susi. That's a really rich answer to a very simple question. Do you know off the top of your head, where is that point where Husserl compares his own concept of the Neuema to the Stoic lecton?
Yeah, absolutely. There are several places, actually. If you want, I will send you, but we will work together on the book. But the most evident one is the historical critique of ideas, where, you know, he goes through his history of philosophy. And in the first book, because it's in two parts, in the first part, he sees himself close to the Stoics, but there are also more recent version of the Husserliana in which you see him saying, this is a very sharp, and I can see some continuity. So I'll send you the more precise references if you want.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Ciao, Kit.
So just following up from that, because that point left an impression on me as well, with the way that you presented the object as quite concrete, and that you spoke of the fullness of it, and that the lecton and the Neuema remains the same regardless of whether we think about it or express it. And at least for the Stoics, that to me sounds quite foreign, because they do speak of the lecton as the opposite of concrete, as incorporeal. So I was just wondering if you have anything to say with that.
Absolutely. So the lecton and the Neuema are evanescent being. That's the expression I borrowed, that seemed very much in common to Husserl and Stoics. The fullness is the concreteness of life. The fullness is another element. The fullness is the Yule, the matter, the concreteness of life that triggers the motor for which it creates the encounter with, oh my God, here there's something I can say. Here there's something I can mean. Here there's, so the lecton, as much as the Neuema, is the new object, is what I can say from the encounter with the fullness of life.
Okay.
And yeah.
So I was just thinking within the Neuema and the lecton, as you see it, it's as when you describe it as being the fullness of life, it's.
I don't describe it like this though. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not.
Okay.
The fullness of life is the trigger. The fullness of life is life. Life that encounters us in a specific way. The result of this encounter, so the uniqueness of my response of the fullness of life, is the lecton and the Neuema. Is what can be said. I'm not equating the two.
Right.
In a logical investigation as well, you have the intentional essence, which is the connection of matter and qualities, and the fullness of life, the fullness. Then in ideas, it will become Yule, it's, the term will change, but it's life that encounters us and requires from us an answer, which will become the otherness in Levinas.
So life, the fullness of life is something like the continuum or just reality. Mm-hmm. And then the Neuema and the lecton is how we receive that or experience. Is mm-hmm. that how you're describing
Absolutely,
it?
Which has its own dignity. It's not ours. That's what I'm trying to say. It's an index of truth, or it's something, it's the Northern Star. It's not that I see an apple as a pear, it's a pear. No, I mean, I might call it like that, but it's a sense, it's its own sense.
See, this is where I'm having a bit of difficulty to comprehend it, because then if we're talking of the lecton and the Neuema as being as you describe it, that it is dignified and it has something on its own, then it seems to be as though there is something that is almost objective or universal about it, or there is something that you're describing that is universal about our own experience of life, which almost removes the subjectivity from the process. And I'm just wondering what...
Every once in a while, let's remove the subject. I'll give you an example. I do philosophical counseling. I love doing this job beside my academic work. Sometimes I have people coming to my office who have lived traumatic experiences or events that never found a word. This event, this encounter with life has its own dignity, is sitting there. And it didn't encounter yet the logic of their understanding, their ability to bestow meaning upon it. What we do through counseling is to find words to that. I had a client who was feeling mad at her husband for reasons that she couldn't understand. we realized after a few months that finally she said it, finally she found the words to express that sense that was sitting in her. She had a very traumatic experience, completely unrelated from her husband, with other men. And once she uttered, once she found the words, once she found the expression to give a sense to that encounter with reality, okay, that was good. Is it a universal truth? I don't think so. I very like the expression that Husserl used of index of truth. I mean, we get, in our life, we try to get more and closer to this encounter. We try to find an adequate way to meet with this encounter. It's not always easy to express all the meaningful encounters that we have with life, even the meaningless, for what it's worth. Our job is to tune in, to live secundum naturam, to find a way to, the evidence gefühl that Husserl was talking about, to find this feeling of evidence for which, that's what it was.
Okay, I'd like to extend that, but I don't know if anyone else has some other questions. Is there anything from? Yeah.
Nope.
Okay, just then one final thing. You say that it's not universal, but it seems that there seems to be a certain pattern which is common, at least for people experiencing that sense. When you described in philosophical counseling that the woman found her way of being able to utter, and then it had this meaning to her. I see it as having a certain pattern which is common to everyone. There seems to be something at play underneath this whole this discussion, that there are common patterns in which people approach those utterances of meaning. I'm not sure if I expressed that very lucidly.
And in that I have no problem. I mean, and also concerning universality, it has been written a lot. I prefer the word general to universal. I spoke about, thought patterns, schemes, schema. We are trying with phenomenology to describe the structure of consciousness without establishing foundations that are bounding. So we try to describe over and over the presupposition of what we are experiencing. In doing so, it would be wonderful to get closer to something as general as possible. Universal maybe, but it's a difficult word. It's a little trickier, but we can get closer to structures. Hopefully. That's why then phenomenology encounter nicely psychology, psychiatry, because you examine different lived experiences and you realize, here there's a structure that can be useful for autism, for example. Imagine the encounter with sense for a low functioning autistic person. There is this encounter, but then the expression, the words, the way to embody it, it takes a complete different route. And thankfully now with phenomenology, we started music projects, dancing projects, well, not only with phenomenology, that allows for different expressions to say what this encounter is.
Okay. Well, thank you from everyone here as well.
What's your name?
Roberto.
Robertus. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have a little bit of housekeeping for Christos to talk about.
Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone for a wonderful, even though quite long day. Tomorrow we start a bit early, the reason being because some of the speakers are in the east part of the earth, so we'll resume tomorrow morning, and I think I figured out a way to solve the problem with the microphone, so the sound hopefully will be better tomorrow. So thank you very much. Have a good rest, and we'll see everyone tomorrow morning.